In 2015, the Chinese State Council published a document called Made in China 2025. It named 10 industries, it named target market share figures, it named a deadline. The US government read it, flagged it, and spent the next 8 years designing a policy architecture specifically intended to prevent it from succeeding. The restrictions came in waves. The entity list additions began in earnest in 2018. Semiconductor export controls tightened in 2019, again in 2022, and again in 2023. Each round more granular than the last, each justified by the same logic. Limit access to foundational technology, and you limit the ceiling of what a competitor can build. That logic is not unreasonable. It is also not what the record shows happened. By 2023, China held roughly 80% of global solar panel manufacturing capacity. Not market share, manufacturing capacity. The distinction matters because capacity determines who sets price, who sets volume, and who can afford to wait out a tariff cycle. American and European manufacturers are not competing for that position. They are negotiating around it. China's battery manufacturers, CATL foremost among them, supplied cells for approximately 37% of all electric vehicles sold globally in 2023. That figure comes from the International Energy Agency's 2024 Global EV Outlook, which is a public document. The next closest competitor held roughly 14%. The gap is not closing. The IEA's own projections show it widening through 2030. In shipbuilding, China's share of global commercial vessel orders exceeded 70% in 2023, according to data published by Clarkson's research. South Korea holds most of the remainder. The United States, for practical purposes, does not have a civilian shipbuilding industry at commercial scale, a fact the US Navy's own force structure assessment acknowledged in 2022 without proposing a credible remedy. High-speed rail. China operates more high-speed track than every other country combined. That figure has been true since approximately 2019, and the gap has continued to extend. Drone manufacturing. DJI holds an estimated 58% of the global consumer and commercial drone market, and the export restrictions placed on DJI in 2020 have not produced a dominant American alternative. Rare earth processing, which is not the same as rare earth mining, is where the architecture becomes visible. The United States has deposits. It does not have the processing infrastructure. China processes approximately 87% of the world's rare earth elements, according to the US Geological Survey's 2023 Mineral Commodity Summaries. That document is published by a US government agency. It does not editorialize. It simply records what is. Two things are both true and on the record. The United States executed a sustained, documented, legally sophisticated campaign to slow Chinese technological development. And Chinese industrial capacity in these 6 sectors expanded during that campaign, in several cases accelerated. That is the tension. It does not resolve itself. The mechanism that allows both facts to coexist is not complicated once you read the sequencing. What the export control architecture targeted was not industrial capacity. It targeted components, specific chips, specific fabrication equipment, specific software licenses. The assumption embedded in that targeting was that component access was the binding constraint on Chinese industrial development. The Made in China 2025 document itself suggests that assumption was never fully tested before the policy was built around it. China's industrial policy did not treat component access as the ceiling. It treated it as a temporary bottleneck, one node in a longer supply chain that could be routed around, replicated, or rendered irrelevant by moving upstream. The 2016 iteration of China's National Medium and Long-Term Science and Technology Development Plan, a document that predates the trade war by 2 years, explicitly identified foreign technology dependence as a strategic liability and allocated funding accordingly. The policy was not reactive. The funding preceded the restriction. CATL's development trajectory is the clearest case. The company was founded in 2011. Its early production relied on Japanese and Korean cell chemistry. By 2017, before the first major US export restrictions, CATL had already begun filing patents on lithium iron phosphate chemistry at a rate that Japanese and Korean competitors could not match. The restrictions that arrived in 2018 and after targeted a supply chain CATL was already engineering its way out of. What the restrictions actually did was accelerate the domestic substitution logic that Chinese industrial planners had already funded. Solar tells the same story with different actors. The US imposed tariffs on Chinese solar panels beginning in 2012, more than a decade ago. The stated purpose was to protect domestic manufacturing. By 2023, the domestic manufacturing base had not recovered to pre-2012 scale, and Chinese manufacturers had used the intervening decade to drive production costs down by roughly 90%, a figure documented in the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory's Tracking the Sun report series. Tariffs raised the price of the imported product. They did not alter the underlying cost structure that made the imported product dominant. The shipbuilding gap requires a different explanation because it was not primarily a technology story. It was a labour cost and infrastructure investment story. But the infrastructure investment was deliberate and documented. China's State Council published shipbuilding industry development plans in 2006, 2013 and 2021. Each successive plan increased berth capacity targets and extended financing instruments for domestic yards. The 2021 plan specifically identified global market share targets that, by the Clarkson's research data, China has already met. The plan said what it would do. It did it. Rare earth processing is where the mechanism becomes most explicit, and where the irony of the US position is most precisely located in the documentary record. The United States closed its primary rare earth processing facility, the Mountain Pass Refinery in California, in 2002. The closure was driven by environmental compliance costs and competition from Chinese processors who were operating under different regulatory frameworks. MP Materials reopened Mountain Pass in 2017, but as of the US Geological Survey's 2023 summary, the facility was still shipping the majority of its concentrate to China for processing because the domestic separation and refining infrastructure had not been rebuilt. The gap was not created by Chinese policy. It was created by the absence of American policy during the years when the gap was forming. That absence is what I keep returning to when I read these documents side by side. The Chinese planning record from 2006 onward shows consistent, compounding investment in exactly the sectors that are now under discussion. The American policy record from the same period shows reactive measures, tariffs, entity listings, export controls, applied after the industrial position had already shifted. Restrictions on what China could access were imposed after China had reduced its dependence on what it was being restricted from. The sequencing is not contested. It is in the documents. What the mechanism produced is a set of industrial positions that export controls, by design, cannot reach. Controls limit flows. They do not restructure capacity that is already built, already operating, and already cost competitive without the inputs it has been denied. The conventional explanation for China's industrial ascent is not wrong. It is incomplete in a specific way that the primary record makes visible. The standard account runs as follows. China subsidised heavily, tolerated losses that private markets would not, used state-directed lending to keep uncompetitive firms alive long enough to achieve scale, and then used that scale to drive down prices until foreign competitors could not stay in the market. This account is accurate as far as it goes. The World Trade Organization's 2023 Trade Policy Review of China documented subsidy levels across manufacturing sectors that are, by any measure, well above what WTO commitments technically permit. The US Trade Representative's annual reports on Chinese trade practices have made the same documentation for 15 consecutive years. The evidence for state subsidy as a mechanism is not in dispute. What that explanation does not account for is timing. Subsidies explain how a firm survives while it scales. They do not explain why Chinese firms in these 6 sectors achieve technological parity, and in several cases technological leadership, on timelines that subsidy economics alone cannot produce. CATL's patent filing rate in battery chemistry between 2017 and 2022 was not the output of a subsidised firm learning slowly behind a tariff wall. It was the output of a firm that had made specific research and development decisions years earlier and was now harvesting them. The subsidy narrative makes China's industrial position look like an artefact of policy distortion. The patent record makes it look like an artefact of compounding investment that was always going to arrive somewhere. The solar case is the clearest place where the conventional explanation reaches its limit. Chinese solar manufacturers did receive substantial state support. They also went through a consolidation period between 2012 and 2016, in which dozens of firms failed, including several that had received state backing. What survived that consolidation were firms with genuine process efficiency advantages, not just capital access. The cost reductions documented by Lawrence Berkeley were not achieved by subsidising inefficiency. They were achieved by firms that had developed manufacturing processes competitors had not matched. The subsidy critique explains the initial scaling. It does not explain the process innovation. Return for a moment to the detail introduced at the opening, the Made in China 2025 document and its named target market shares. When the document became a point of diplomatic friction around 2018, the Chinese government quietly reduced its public references to it. State media stopped citing it. Officials began describing it as a misunderstood initiative. The Western commentary read that retreat as evidence that external pressure was working, that naming the strategy had embarrassed Beijing into pulling back. The retreat was not a pullback. The targets remained embedded in downstream provincial planning documents and sector-specific implementation guidelines that received no equivalent diplomatic attention. The 2021 iteration of China's 5-year plan did not use the Made in China 2025 branding. It allocated the same categories of investment to the same sectors, with updated timelines that reflected where those sectors actually were, which was, in most cases, ahead of the 2025 targets. The document changed its name. The capital flows did not change direction. What the record tells me is that the Western policy response was calibrated against the announcement rather than the implementation. Diplomatic pressure targeted the branding. Export controls targeted the component flows. Neither targeted the institutional capacity, the engineering schools, the research institutes, the manufacturing clusters that was converting investment into industrial position. That institutional layer is largely immune to trade policy instruments because it is not a flow. It is a stock. You cannot sanction a graduate cohort. The conventional explanation also carries an implicit assumption that is worth naming directly, that Chinese industrial success in these sectors required Western technology as an input, and that restricting that input would therefore constrain the output. For semiconductors at the leading edge, that assumption may still hold, though even there, the 2023 Huawei Mate 60 Pro episode introduced evidence that the constraint is less binding than the export control architecture assumed. For the 6 sectors examined here, the assumption was already outdated by the time the restrictions arrived. The inputs had been substituted. The output was already in production. The tension from the opening resolves in the sequencing. America's export control architecture was not ineffective because it was poorly designed. It was ineffective in these 6 sectors because it was applied after the condition it was meant to prevent had already been established. The restrictions were real. The industrial positions they were meant to constrain were also real and were already self-sustaining by the time the restrictions arrived. Both facts are true because they operated on different timelines. That is the reconciliation. Not sabotage, not incompetence, not regulatory capture. A timing problem with structural consequences. The sectors where American technological leadership remains most credible, advanced logic semiconductors, certain aerospace subsystems, large language model infrastructure, share a common feature. They are sectors where the United States maintained sustained, compounding investment through the period when Chinese industrial planners were focused elsewhere, and where switching costs are high enough that market position compounds rather than erodes. The lesson the semiconductor case is supposed to teach is that export controls work. The more accurate reading is that controls work when applied before the competitor has achieved independence from what is being controlled. In solar, batteries, shipbuilding, rail, drones, and rare earth processing, that window had already closed. The Chips and Science Act, signed in 2022, allocated roughly $52 billion to domestic semiconductor manufacturing and research. The policy logic is sound. Rebuild the stock, not just restrict the flow. But the Act's implementation audit, published by the Government Accountability Office in 2023, noted that funding disbursement was proceeding slower than the legislation anticipated, that several announced fab projects had revised their timelines, and that the workforce pipeline required to staff new facilities did not yet exist at the needed scale. The money was appropriated. The institutional capacity to deploy it was not yet there. China's position in the 6 sectors examined here was not achieved by a single policy or a single investment cycle. It was achieved by 2 decades of compounding decisions, provincial, national, and firm level, that were individually unremarkable and collectively decisive. The Made in China 2025 document attracted attention because it was explicit. The planning architecture that preceded and survived it attracted less attention because it was ordinary. Industrial policy, published in 2006, does not generate the same diplomatic friction as industrial policy announced in 2015. By the time the friction arrived, the compounding had already run for a decade. My honest read on the 6 sectors is this. The question of whether China beat America in these industries is already settled by the production data, the patent filings, and the market share figures, all of which are public, most of which are published by Western institutions. The more consequential question is whether the United States has developed a policy instrument capable of operating on the same time horizon as the problem it is trying to address. A 10-year industrial plan cannot be answered with a 2-year appropriation cycle and a trade enforcement mechanism designed for discrete transactions. The mismatch is not a political failure, it is an institutional one. And institutional mismatches are slower to correct than political ones. The one forward-looking statement the record supports is specific. The sectors where this competition is still genuinely open are the ones where neither side has yet achieved the kind of manufacturing scale and process depth that makes a position self-sustaining. Advanced packaging in semiconductors is one. Solid-state battery chemistry is another. Biological manufacturing, the use of engineered organisms to produce materials and compounds at industrial scale, is a third. In each of those areas, the investment decisions being made in the next 3 to 5 years will determine whether the sequencing problem repeats. The documents that will matter most are not the ones being announced. They are the ones being filed quietly in patent offices and provincial planning bureaus right now. If this kind of primary source reading is useful to you, the channel is where it lives. No summaries, no press release versions, just the documents and what they actually say.